The AWARE project's aim is to balance the public conversation about psychedelics, spread accurate information, and give a new face to psychedelia. We feel that this change will occur through connection and relationship, one individual at a time. We are calling on everyone whose lives have been improved through the mindful use of psychedelics to educate themselves and become ambassadors for the psychedelic experience. Show those around you that people who use psychedelics mindfully cross all social, racial, economic, and political boundaries.
Research coordinator at University of California, San Francisco, where he's working on psilocybin-assisted therapy. And so, he's not a one-trick pony here. He's covering his bases with the research. And he got his master's in public health from Columbia, the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health, where I met him. We were classmates together, and where we bonded over our passion for these tools and these medicines and their ability to really help our society, which is seeing so many sicknesses in so many areas, from addiction to depression to rising suicide. So, on top of being an incredible researcher, Phil is an amazing human, and I'm excited that he's going to share his research, where he did his master's thesis on, which is about the qualitative experience of folks in the MDMA-Assisted Psychotherapy for PTSD. So please give a warm round of applause to our speaker tonight, Phillip Perl.
Thank you all for having me. It's always really nice to be amongst this community. Like Jared said, I did this research while I was in grad school, and out of about 400 people in my program, there were 2 people who knew what the heck I was talking about all year, and both of them are here right now. Amazing. The other 398 people just thought it was nuts. So I really am grateful to be here and to be doing this work. I'll be presenting on the qualitative analysis of the MAPS MDMA-Assisted Psychotherapy trial. MAPS is Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And so I also work at UCSF as an assistant research coordinator on a psilocybin-assisted therapy trial. I'm happy to chat about that with anyone afterwards. It's a little too early on in the process to be presenting about that, but happy to talk about it with anyone. So, next slide, please. This is my team, Will, Jerry, and Michi. So Will is kind of our leader. He was doing his dissertation on this, and then Jerry was his advisor, and Michi and I came in to help out with the data, and there's just tons and tons of data. So I'm here representing them as well as myself, and also I just want to give a big thanks to the participants who took part in this trial after years of having treatment-resistant PTSD to take a chance on an experimental treatment and share their stories for research. I'm just grateful for all the participants. And so here's a quote I just heard Michael Pollan say recently. There's nothing more real to you than your subjective experience of reality, and there's nothing more opaque to science. So I think that's a great rationale for qualitative research in general. The quantitative research is also very important. Quantitative is all the stats and numbers and figures that show, how certain measures about how people are changing, but the qualitative is all about subjective experience, and it's really hard for science to measure that. So that's what we're trying to do here in this project. Next slide, please. So the background, so we were looking at interviews from participants in the MAPS Phase 2 study site in Charleston, South Carolina. So there were 26 participants in this study site. At the time that we were doing research on it, we had interview transcripts from 17 participants. And so everyone had severe treatment-resistant PTSD. It was mostly veterans. There were also 3 firefighters and 1 police officer. The veterans were mostly combat veterans. There were also about 3 who had experienced sexual assault in the military, and that was their main cause of PTSD. So in our 17, there were 12 men and 5 women. And we were looking at long-term follow-up interviews 1 year after the study finished, doing qualitative analysis of the interviews. And the MAP study itself, how it works, they do 3 sessions of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy with 2 therapists in the room, and then plus weekly non-drug therapy for 3.5 months. And the main quantitative outcome measure they're looking at is the CAP scores, which is clinician-administered PTSD scale, which gives you a number from 0 to 120, and anything above 50 counts as PTSD. And so since we're doing qualitative research, I just want to talk for a few minutes about qualitative and quantitative research in general, and then I'll get into what we did and what we found. So like I said, so quantitative research is more, you have an hypothesis and you test it. And from what you find, then you can make predictions. Qualitative is more of a wide-angle lens. It's more to understand and interpret lived experience. Quantitative, you can have a really large sample. In the MAPS, all the MAPS phase 2 studies, they had over 100. They had 105 participants. But in the qualitative, we just have 17. So really looking in depth at a smaller number. And then with quantitative, you have these specific variables, PTSD, depression, a number of very specific measures, whereas qualitative, you're looking more at the whole picture. And the type of data, quantitative, you get numbers and statistics, and qualitative, words, images, objects. In our case here, it's words, but qualitative can come in a number of forms. Quantitative, you get precise measurements, whereas qualitative, open-ended responses, interviews, observations. Sometimes qualitative research is people going out and just observing what's going on in a particular setting. And then so qualitative, we identify patterns, features, and themes, and we're exploring, discovering new things that maybe we didn't even think to ask about in the research, whereas quantitative is more about these statistical relationships to describe and explain exactly what's going on. And so then qualitative, we hope, can have a wider, have more breadth and depth, whereas quantitative can get a lot of really good information, but is often very specific. So then just a couple more points about qualitative research. So you really get the actor's point of view. Like the person that you're studying, you really get their point of view. I think it's really important in research not to come out of it with the researcher's point of view, but the people you're studying, you want their point of view. And you end up with descriptive data that can't be summarized in numbers. So you'll see in a few minutes the descriptive data that came out of our study. And then what I think is really important, you examine how people derive meaning from experience. You're not just seeing what's happening and how it's happening, but really how they derive meaning from it. And a non-psychedelic example, homelessness in New York City. So my thesis advisor, as I was writing this, he's done a lot of great work on homelessness. And so with quantitative work, you can count how many homeless people there are. You can look at what illnesses they have. You can look at demographics, all sorts of stuff. But with qualitative research, which is what this advisor, Kim Hupper, did, he spent a lot of time with unhoused people in New York, and he learned how they make meaning of their lives. You can learn not just what their health issues are, but how they make meaning of those health issues, what they do to take care of it, and why, and to really understand their lived experience and really take a long time to build trust. And from that, it can help to create more effective interventions. If you're just doing quantitative research, you might be asking the wrong questions and developing interventions to help people based on the wrong questions, and then it won't help. So to really understand what's going on can be very helpful. And I think it's, I don't want to make it sound like qualitative is better than quantitative. I think they work really well together. And the qualitative is also more inductive than deductive reasoning. So next slide. So with inductive, as I've been saying, you kind of start with this big observation, then you look for patterns within that big observation, and then from that you can, after a long time, find a hypothesis and a theory. Whereas deductive, you start with this theory and hypothesis, and then you go in and see if that hypothesis is true. And so why do we need qualitative research, specifically in psychedelic-assisted therapy? Well, the story that comes from that CAPS measure, which is the main PTSD measure, and other assessments can be pretty limited. You get a number, but there might be two people with the same number with vastly different symptoms, or maybe they have the same symptoms on paper, but vastly different manifestations of those symptoms. And that experience will be missed if you just look at quantitative. And there are different nuances, so specifically if you look at the participant's point of view, the qualitative research will go a long way. And then mechanisms of action, psychedelic-assisted therapy, even though it's been around a long time, we're in this current new renaissance for psychedelic therapy research, and so there's a lot of new information coming out. And so even though we may have a lot of understanding about the neuroscience or different aspects of psychedelic therapy, to really talk to people and understand what it was like for them, we can get a lot of new information. And then integration, this one's really specific to our study, since we were looking at interviews from 1 year after the treatment ended. What were the challenges that happened when they went back into their personal lives and their personal routines? Sometimes people did really well on the CAP score. They had a lot of healing, but then they go back into their personal lives and their relationships are a lot different all of a sudden, because they've had this drastic change. Even though it might be very positive, it changes their relationship with their spouse, and it has all these ripple effects. And it's just, there's all these social and cultural factors. And so the detailed, wide-angle lens of qualitative research can help with that. And then it's question generating, similarly, because this is a new renaissance. Sometimes we don't even, we have good questions, but we still need more questions as we continue to research. And as I'll show throughout my presentation, we thought of some new questions that we suggest should be asked in future studies. And then just the beauty of the experience by hearing people's stories. It's very beautiful, and I think that's worthwhile in its own right. So there have been a few other qualitative studies in psychedelic science in the last few years. NYU, they do work with psilocybin for anxiety associated with cancer. They actually came out with two qualitative publications. I recommend checking them out, they did a really good job. In Switzerland, there's a qualitative study for LSD therapy with anxiety. Johns Hopkins, this one just came out like a couple weeks ago. They're looking at psilocybin for smoking cessation and the participants' experience. And at Imperial College in London, they have a qualitative study. For one of them, they gave participants psilocybin in an fMRI machine, so that wasn't a therapeutic context. But still, then they talked to the people who were in that study, and what was really interesting, even just being in an MRI machine, that some of them had meaningful spiritual experiences. And then a more recent one also, psilocybin for depression. So the three least recent ones were really helpful for me as I was doing this research, and then it's great to see more qualitative studies coming out. And so real quick, I'll just go through the methods of what we did, and then I'll get into the good stuff. So there were semi-structured interviews for each participant 1 year after they finished the study. These interviews were conducted by Andy and Michael Midhofer, who are they're also the trial therapists. And the method we used is called interpretative phenomenological analysis. Phenomenology basically means the study of consciousness. So we chose this method because since we're dealing with psychedelics, we're dealing with consciousness. And this is also a really good method to use when you're studying something new. And since this is the first qualitative study for this specific field. It lets us just explore, starting with the participants' experience and from their words, and not coming in with any preconceived ideas. So 3 of us, team members, we did close readings, we coded the transcripts in this software called LSTI and assembled everything into themes. And we were looking for stories that were missed in the quantitative. And so then I had 2 main aims as I was doing this research. So the first aim that I'll talk about is investigate experiences that were missed in the quantitative reporting. And then second, it's hard to read, but explore the psychosocial factors that possibly contributed to varying degrees of success. So as I'll show you later a graph of the CAP scores, how people were doing, but some people did really, really well during the treatment, and then a year later were still doing very well. Some people did really well, and then a year later had some symptoms return. So I wanted to look at what is going on in their personal lives that allowed some people to keep getting better, and some people had some symptoms return. And so this is the quantitative study. I just want to mention this came out just 2 months ago in the journal The Lancet Psychiatry. So if anyone is interested, I can email this to you. But I really recommend checking it out. This has all the quantitative numbers. It shows exactly how well everyone in the South Carolina site did. And it's really a lot of remarkable results. People did a lot of healing. And so they look at CAP scores, and then there are a number of other secondary quantitative measures: sleep quality, depression, post-traumatic growth, personality traits, global assessment of functioning. Across the board, people did really, really well. But just looking, as I was reading this, just looking over these numbers, I'm a qualitative researcher, but I just really want to know what are the stories behind all these numbers. And so, looking at some of these stories, just for example, one participant, their CAP score at the beginning was 92, and then after treatment, their CAP score was 81, and then a year later was 89. So this is one example. This is one of 2 participants who really didn't do very well just looking at the CAP score. But they said there's improvement from every one of my problems I had when I first came here. So that shows that this person had a really positive experience that was completely missed from the CAP score. And then also what happens in the year between treatment and long-term follow-up CAPS measurements. So now I'm going to talk about some of the main themes that emerged from doing this type of research. And so one main theme, as you might expect, is enhanced quality of life. And one participant, they said, I don't worry about things as much as I used to. I just don't. I don't feel I need to always carry a gun with me. I've come to the conclusion that I think I'm an easygoing and well-mannered enough now to talk to people and talk myself out of most situations. I don't have to fight. If I think back, I think that I did feel I needed to fight all the time before. And someone else, they said in their interview, it was really the first MDMA session that we had where I consider a breakthrough, where I was able to clearly see that I had a big disconnecting compassion that I had for myself. After that first session, when I kind of had that epiphany, I was able to get to sleep. I don't stay up until 5 or 6 in the morning anymore unless I want to. It's great. So in that case, you really get to see some of these symptom changes come to life. And you can also, I think it also helps to understand if someone's doing really a lot better a year later, and you can understand these ripple effects. So they're able to sleep more, and so they're just more alert and awake, in addition to the PTSD symptoms going away. Improved access to emotions was a big theme. We saw all 17 participants talk about. So one participant said, I had a lot of defenses going up into the therapies that I had previous to the MDMA, and it made accomplishing any substantial breakthroughs in what I was going through pretty impossible. So with the MDMA, it broke this hard outer shell that was up that kept me from being able to connect with the therapies I was going through. So now when I go and I'm doing the cognitive processing therapy, I understand the material and how it's beneficial. And so there are actually a couple themes touched on in this quote. Also, increased openness to further therapy was another theme we found. And that's another way to understand how maybe the treatment can be successful long term. In another participant, they said, "I just feel now, and I used to not feel on purpose. I used to keep myself hardened and everything. So I then realized I'm not messed up, I just feel a lot more. It's kind of new to me, so it's really difficult. I still have to sometimes go off to the side somewhere and let some tears out because I just get so emotional over the smallest things." And so again, I think it's just a really beautiful quote. And it also touches on, you see the nuance and the complexity there. There are a lot of improvements and they could access a lot more emotions, but this positive change brought about this new challenge that they touched on. Another theme, reduced drug use. I think this is a really important theme to talk about, especially to a general audience. Like Caitlin said, people might think, oh, you're just going to give drugs to people to help them. But what we saw was a lot of reduced drug use. Pretty much the only people who didn't have reduced drug use were people who didn't use drugs before the study. So a couple of quotes on that. Someone said, I still smoke, right? But I used to smoke from the time I got up to the time I went to bed. And it worked because I had PTSD. But if I did that now, I would just be miserable. And someone said, I started learning the tools where I don't need to depend or rely upon medicine or alcohol or any kind of even deviant behavior to feel better or get through things and things like that. So I think that's been the most valuable. Next slide, please. And then improved relations with family and community. This is actually something that wasn't planned to be asked about in the interviews, but the vast majority of people talked about this. So someone said, it's definitely better now. I talk to people. I had a classmate come over to my house for the first time in months last week. That was huge. And someone else, I truly believe if I hadn't been in this study, I would have never even been able to, the relationship would have never even happened. So in this case, this person elaborated on a romantic partnership they entered into, and it was the first time they had been romantic in 6 years, and the study helped them open up to enter that relationship. And then the role of the MDMA in the therapy process. This was the main focus of my research partner, Will. So he was looking at specifically the way MDMA releases oxytocin and decreases activity in the amygdala and other effects in the brain. He was looking for evidence, but he was looking through the participant interviews to see if the participant descriptions of their experience match up with that. And someone said, I think that the MDMA gave me the ability to feel as though I was capable and safe of tackling the issues. And someone else said, the memories still pop up, but they're not as distressing. I understand where they come from. And the third person, it takes a much higher level to trigger something. And it makes everything far more manageable and normal. And again, it's really moving to see just specifically how the MDMA in the therapy process, just from 3 sessions, specifically helps and how it helped them on top of just the regular talk therapy. And so my second aim, my other goal of this research was to explore how some participants kept improving after treatment ended while some did not. So when they went back home, did they experience new stressors, really going back into a traumatic environment? I have this in quotes, significant intervening life events. When MAPS they published an earlier results of their study in 2013, and they were wondering the same question, but they didn't do qualitative research at that point. In their publication, they used the phrase significant intervening life events as something that may have affected the participants in 2013. So I figured I would look into this. And indeed, there were 6 participants who had a large-ish increase in CAPS after the treatment ended, and 5 of those 6 people had a new major stressor in their lives. A loved one passing away, hospitalization, car crash, some major new stressor. And of the other 9 who got better and stayed better, only 1 of those 9 mentioned a new major stressor. So this is a small sample, and there's no definitive answers from this, but it's a theme worth continued exploration. And so this graph is the CAPS scores over time. I just have the 3 points on here: baseline when the study started, the end of treatment, and long-term follow-up. And so the average at the beginning is 92. People had really severe treatment-resistant PTSD. The cutoff is 50, so on average they're way above 50 at the beginning. At the end of treatment, the average is 34. These are purely quantitative results. You can see how successful it is. And then at long-term follow-up, the average is 41. So on average, scores went back up by 7, so a little bit of an increase in that next year. And what I was especially interested in are these lines that make a V shape. So some of these lines that make a V, that means the treatment was successful, and then they had a somewhat significant return to symptoms. And so they didn't, it's important to note they didn't relapse into PTSD. All 17 are actually doing better a year later than before the study started. But some people, they had some symptoms return, and I think it's important to know why that is so we can start to mitigate those factors in future studies. And so one thing I was looking at, this is hard to read, but the blue ones represent those people who kept getting better, and the red is people who those are the 6 V shapes. And I was looking at all these different themes: significant intervening life events, improved family relationships, friendships, drug use, reduced drug use, engagement in new activities, and openness to further therapy. I was also analyzing these transcripts for a number of other factors, social support, but just for the sake of putting these on the graph. So these last 5 were pretty evenly across the board, whether or not symptoms came back or not. They experienced these improvements. And I originally was going in thinking maybe social support would have a big effect, but I ended up not finding that in this particular sample. But I did find that the significant intervening life events, 5 of the 6 people who had a significant intervening life event, their CAP scores increased after treatment. And so this is really important information, I think. So when I was in grad school, I was studying social determinants of health. So I was looking at race and class and gender and all these other social factors that can influence someone's health. And so if someone is marginalized for any number of reasons, then they're more likely to be finishing the therapy and going back into a traumatic environment. And if the treatment is then less likely to be successful for them because they're marginalized and because they're in a traumatic environment, that's really important for us to look at in the psychedelic research community. In our study, in this case, it was 16 out of 17 people were white, 1 person was Native American. So we weren't specifically looking at race in this case, but in the future, that's something really important to look at. And it's just also really, really important, I think, if this treatment is legalized in 2021, as some experts are currently predicting, then we won't have to stick to such a strict regimen of exactly 3 treatments, and maybe there'll be some more wiggle room that people could come back after 6 months or after a year and do another session. I think it's something really important to keep exploring. So this was a pilot study, it was the first one, and so myself along with my team, mostly my research partner Will, are hoping to plan the qualitative portion of the study for phase 3. So we can go to the next slide, please. So the MAPS phase 3 study will have at least 230 participants in the first chunk of it, and there are 12 sites across the US. So the qualitative portion is still being developed. I think one thing that's important to look at is this long-term follow-up, and how does one's environment and how traumatic and stressful is a personal environment that affects the long-term success of people in the study. And there's continued exploration of these emerging themes. I just mentioned 5 themes out of several that we found, and I'm sure there are several more that we didn't find and that will be found in the future. And I got involved. I was really lucky to get involved. I basically just contacted MAPS and said I'm a grad student and I'd love to help out. And so if there are any grad students or future grad students in the crowd, there'll be a lot of qualitative research happening and probably opportunities for grad students who want to work for free to do this research. So, thank you.
So if you guys have any questions, we'll do Q&A.
Yeah, I had never heard of the acronym is IPA is something phenomenological analysis.
Yeah.
Investigative.
Interpretative phenomenological analysis.
Yeah,
It's a fancy.
I was wondering if you could describe that process a little bit more.
Yeah. So in qualitative research, there are a number of different theories or different methods people use to research. So grounded theory is a big qualitative method. IPA is a pretty rare one, but it's used a lot in psychedelic research. So phenomenology just kind of means the study of consciousness or the study of experience, and then interpretative, I don't know why they use interpretative instead of interpretive, but so just based on the participants' words and their describing of their experience, you have to interpret it. You can't just like be in their experience. You have to, it kind of goes through this series of translations, from their experience to their words to your interpretation of it. So the process, so we have these long interviews, and they're semi-structured to really allow the participants to, if they have something to express that the researchers or interviews didn't think of, they're open to go into that. But then there's also set questions ahead of time just to keep things moving. And then with the qualitative analysis and coding, so there are 3 of us, and at least 2 of us would read each transcript and code it for certain themes. So we have this long code book. So one thing we'd code for is, say, like spiritual experience. If someone was talking about a spiritual experience, we would highlight it in the software with our code. And it's a very iterative process, so 2 of us read it, and then we compare codes, and we kind of talk. And so over time, reading it and rereading it, we come up with these different themes. So it's, with qualitative research, it's not super, so I don't know, we have this method. It's not like you have to do things the exact way, but with IPA, it's good for psychedelic research because it really starts with that participant experience. And a lot of the healing happens from the experience. It's not happening from the interaction of the molecules in the body, especially a year later if they're still healing. It's all about the experience, so that's why we chose IPA.
And the code book that you're using to code these themes, that's an established code book, or you create it specific for this study?
We created it specific for this study.
So where did the themes come from that you put in the code book? You hypothesized those first and then applied them? Or was that after you'd read a bit and then themes emerged and then you just have to code?
Yeah, that's after you read it a bit and then themes emerge. And it's an iterative process. Just to quote our grad school professor, qualitative research is a bad parallel Parker. You never really get there, you're always adjusting slightly. Jared?
So you had mentioned, qualitative research is great at finding the stories that the numbers don't tell. So I was just wondering if there was any particular story that really moved you, if anyone stood out, and also if there was anything, in the research that just you had mentioned there was something that you weren't expecting. If there was anything that just totally came out of left field, and a story that you're like, wow, I didn't expect to see that in this.
I think the biggest thing, there's nothing specifically that I wasn't expecting, but I think like in the like improved family relationships and improved friendships, that was something that wasn't on the interview guide, but like pretty much everyone talked about that. And so that story, I gave a quote of the person who entered a romantic partnership for the first time in 6 years, and so she elaborated throughout her hour or two about that, and yeah, that was really moving after years of not going out and meeting people. Someone else had a similar story where she would never. Someone was a mother of a young kid who would never want to go out, and so just a little change she could like go to the grocery store with her young child. So as I was reading this stuff, reading people's stories, I definitely got lost in it and kind of forgot. I was doing research sometimes, just kind of get into these stories. Yeah.
What was the demographics of it? You just mentioned ethnicity, but what else, like gender and age?
Gender was 12 men, 5 women. The age was, I don't remember specifically actually, but the young was about like 25 to 60, pretty big range.
Yeah, I'd be curious in the difference between children and adults, in that, children have different memories and they have fewer boundaries.
You mean children in the studies, or people who?
People that work, children in the studies, yeah.
Well, all the participants are adults.
They are, okay, so children haven't been approached. I mean, probably that's like tricky territory to get into. Somebody has to release it.
It's required for drugs that are going to go on the market.
Yeah. One more question was, do you think the people who are facilitating this, do you think they have an effect on the outcome?
Definitely, yeah. It's actually a really good point. So the therapists in this study, their names are Andy and Michael Minhofer, and they've been doing this work for decades, and they train other therapists, and they're really, really good. And they, so also in this study, so everyone did the same dose eventually, but some people, they had 2 doses that were smaller, and then those people went on to do the same dose as everyone. But some of them, they had a big treatment response even with the smaller dose, and I think that's because these therapists are really good. So that's something that'll happen in phase 3 when there's so many more participants. There'll also be so many more therapists. They won't all be Andy and Michael, so that'll definitely affect the treatment outcomes.
And I want to add too that they do legally have the opportunity, if you're a therapist participating in any of these studies, you have the legal right to take MDMA and have an assisted psychotherapy session prior to serving the medicine. So I think that makes you kind of a unique therapist just by having that experience. It's not required, of course, but I think important for relating to your client.
I respect it.
Yeah, how was the MDMA sourced? How can you ensure the quality? And I didn't get the dosage.
The dose was, they split up into 3 doses. 35 milligrams, 75, and 125. And then everyone who did the 75 and 40, or the 75 and 35, they could move on to the 125 and do 3 of those. And it's all sourced from this chemist, David Nichols. It's all at Purdue University. It's actually, I think it's all the same batch is being used that was made like 30 years ago. I don't remember exactly, but it's the same stuff that's been used all this time.
1986.
86.
Good year. Kind of related to that last point, is there any plan to use a qualitative research approach to kind of look at sort of fine-grained mechanisms of action, or at least perceived mechanisms from the participants? Because I'm an adherence rater on the site, so I've seen a lot of these sessions, and there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
It's intense, amazing support from the therapist, there's exposure, I'm guessing since it's placebo-controlled, there is something special about the MDMA that's really making these really amazing effects. But I'm wondering, even within the MDMA, what part of that experience is kind of the driver, if that makes any sense? Can this research be used to figure that out?
Yeah, it is actually my research partner, Will, is specifically looking at that. He's more of a neuroscience expert, and he looked at that a bit in these interviews. That wasn't specifically an objective of the interviews before, as the interviews were being planned, but there's still a lot of great information. But going forward, they'll plan to look into that specifically.
I had a second question real quick. Sorry, do we know what these participants are doing after they're done with the therapy? One of them mentioned that they're in cognitive processing therapy. I'm curious, how many of them go on to do another type of therapy versus just, are done with treatment in general?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a big reason why the long-term follow-up interviews are important, because they go back home and they're free to do whatever they want, obviously. And out of these 17, it was 12 had more, went back and continued doing just some other therapy.
2 questions. I think you said did you use the results of the qualitative research to pick results of the quantitative research to pick who you were studying qualitatively?
No.
Did you just randomly pick those people, or?
Well, so at the time it was just the transcripts that were available to us from MAPS.
Okay.
We recently got 2 more, so we'll have that, and then there are a few more that I'm still waiting to get them. So it's just random.
Just whatever was available.
So we're hoping to work on this together and put it into a publication, and hopefully by then we'll have we'll have everyone's transcripts.
And can you just say more about MDMA? I didn't know it was considered a psychedelic, and I don't really know much about it. What does it do? What does it feel like?
Yeah, MDMA it's the active ingredient in ecstasy or Molly that sometimes is used as a recreational party drug, but until it was criminalized in 1985, it was used in therapy legally across the country. I think it was 4,000 psychiatrists were using it. And so the way it works in the brain, briefly, is that it decreases the activity in the amygdala, which is kind of the smoke detector of the brain. So in that way, it allows participants to access the traumatic memory without setting off that fear response. So that's a big barrier to therapy for a lot of people. If they can't think about or access that memory, they can't work on it. So it gives this window. It lasts about 3-4 hours, so it'll give them 3-4 hours to access that memory. It increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is more reasoning, so it kind of allows, so if someone has this traumatic memory for several decades, it kind of allows them to think, oh, this happened 20 years ago, and sort of move it from short-term memory to long-term memory. And then also a big mechanism of action, it releases serotonin and oxytocin, so you feel a closeness with the people you're with. So it helps the person trust the therapist very quickly. And so that's also helpful the next week, the next several weeks when they go back and just do regular non-drug talk therapy. From that MDMA, they'll trust people. They'll trust the therapist more.
Thank you.
Did anyone experience increased depression after sessions? Because I know, like, personally, people who have experienced depression after using MDMA, and I don't know if maybe they're just not using pure MDMA, or if maybe they had so much of the dose that it, you know, just curious if anyone reported that.
Yeah, people didn't talk about that so much. It could have happened. These interviews were a year later, so maybe they just didn't talk about it. They also do, as part of the studies they stay overnight. So they do the therapy and they stay there. And there's a night attendant who's there with them through the next day, and then they do a therapy session the next day. So they're watched. I mean, they're kept safe and kept, in this environment when they did the therapy. That's a good question. I was wondering that too, and it's quite possible there was more of it that they just didn't express a year later.
Did your team watch the entire transcripts from specific patients, or did you just sort of drop in? Because that's a lot of hours.
We just looked at the transcripts from the interviews a year later.
Oh, okay, not the actual experimental session.
No, not for this.
Because of the current research that's being done on studying the brain, I was wondering if things that were, say, blocked would become unblocked and remembered.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, takes a lot of information to decide that, but
yeah, I really don't. I don't know.
Yeah, makes sense.
So just to kind of clarify on the last graph that you showed, it looks like those who had the most significant relapsing had somewhat traumatic events afterwards, so maybe that made them more susceptible to the relapsing. So would you say that that at least appears to be, obviously needs more investigation, but it appears that a traumatic event or a traumatic environment following the therapy reduces the efficacy of it? Is that kind of what the summary of that looks like?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, reduces the long-term efficacy. I've seen maps use the word durability.
Yeah, I heard that similar effect described as people that have experienced PTSD, perhaps. It's unknown, but it appears they may have been more sensitive before they experienced a traumatic event, and then maybe possibly continue to have that sensitivity through life, so they're more at risk for redeveloping or having other sort of emotional issues.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's consistent.
Yeah, I've read that too, just like in non-psychedelic PTSD research, that having one traumatic event makes you more susceptible to traumatic events causing PTSD later. So that could be what's one of the factors going on here. And so again, I think that's something super important to be sensitive to in future studies and in future, if and when this is legal.
Were there any similarities or differences between the other qualitative research on psychedelics, like LSD for anxiety and psilocybin for the cancer patients? I mean, I know they're totally different crowds, but were there anything like notable that you noticed?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities. I think the most notable difference has to do with spiritual experience. With MDMA, there's a lot less spiritual experience, and when the participant does have spiritual experience, that's not correlated with the treatment outcome. And then with psilocybin, having a spiritual experience is very much associated with the depression decreasing. But otherwise, it's a lot of a lot of similarities. People describe it as a very meaningful experience, describe, self-compassion, and really are a lot of similarities.
I have this psychedelic psychotherapy book. I don't know who wrote it, but they were mentioning that before using MDMA psychotherapy that they were suggesting people get off their SSRIs or antidepressants 6 weeks before. I'm just wondering if they had the participants do that, if they were already on antidepressants, and I don't know, what does that look like?
So they do have to go off SSRIs, and there's a long list of medications. And so I think usually, I can speak to working at UCSF. So my boss over there is a psychiatrist, and then also everyone has their own personal psychiatrist or doctor. And so we kind of tell them what they would need to do, and then we have them work with their personal doctor to go off those meds in time. And then, So then if they would rather stay on their meds, then that's okay. We won't be in the study. But
Gotcha. Okay.
then there are also some other meds that it's okay to keep taking, but just not